Okay, friends, hello. So in case you missed me saying it, I'm going to keep it in edit mode. I just noticed in other presentations that it was like a little easier to see. If that's not true, you know, somebody can let me know. But this is history, U.S. immigration. So we're going to hop right in. A little bit about me. My name is Mikhayla Stover. I live in Washington, D.C. I am a third-year law student at Catholic University of America, which means I'm almost free. I work in the field of immigration. I have completed policy internships for CLINIC, which is the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, as well as the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And then I'm currently working as a student attorney at my law school's immigration clinic. And I've done a bunch of other workshops and events and things like that. My specialty is human rights and access to justice issues within the world of U.S. immigration, particularly as they apply to asylum seekers and those incarcerated in the immigration detention system in the U.S. Some like recent projects that I've done have been studying cruel conditions in the detention camps, particularly medical neglect. I work on evaluation of U.S. tactics towards immigrants under the UN's legal theory of genocide and other international legal principles. And then my most recent project, I am currently writing a legal article on courthouse arrests of immigrants, which falls under the attack on due process. So basically, all of this means that I'm very good at two things, and those two things are immigration policy and making people really depressed at parties. Very sad when people ask what my job is. So before we begin, a few quick caveats. So this is a history discussion and not a policy discussion. All that means is that I won't super get into how things are now or the necessarily like legislation policy things, only because that's sort of outside the scope. I have my contact information at the very end of this presentation. Feel free to email me. Happy to talk about it anytime. The next is oppression is America's original bipartisan effort. Right now, I know that a lot of the people who are committing the oppression are a part of the political Republican Party. However, it is an equal opportunity. Obama had the most deportations. IRA, which we're going to talk about, was under the Clinton administration. So it is a bipartisan effort. So buckle your seatbelts. We're going to be moving really fast. My goals for this session are to introduce you to the historical roots of forced migration in Latin America, the reluctance of the U.S. to take responsibility for those forced to migrate due to its own interventions, as well as the historical ties of the private prison industry with U.S. immigration. Each one of these topics could be a semester course. So this is, I like emphasize introduction. So basically, all three of those things are this pattern, which I call the vicious cycle of U.S. immigration. And those kind of three branches, if you will, of the cycle are destabilization, deflection of responsibility, which ultimately leads to the detention of innocents. So let's like talk about the population that we're even working with, right? So we work with those who are displaced, right? And displacement just means they are forced to leave their homes. As of the end of last year, 80 million people worldwide are currently considered displaced by the United Nations. That's roughly 1% of the entire world's population. 4.2 million of these are asylum seekers, and that's the population that I mostly work with. So we're gonna like hop right into the first prong, which is destabilization. This really is the key to most of the historical buildup to why our immigration system is the way it is today, is destabilization of Latin American countries, or as I call it, why everything is our fault 101. So I'm mostly going to focus on destabilization in Latin America, but remember that these principles hold true to virtually every region in the world, particularly the Middle East and North Africa. But because a lot of the immigrants that come to our southern border and who I work with are from Latin America, I'm really just going to focus on those. So you'll notice I go in threes. So the three things that I'm going to talk about that are really the main components of destabilization in the region are the sponsorship of coups and civil war by the United States in Latin American countries, the economic oppression of the people in those countries by U.S. corporations, and then las maras, which is the gangs, and we'll talk about what that means. So sponsorship of coups and civil war. This is so much bigger than you would expect, right? And hardly anybody really knows about it inside of the actual United States. The purpose of a lot of our sponsorship of coups is to promote the right-wing or capitalist administrations in Latin America, right? So especially in the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, right, there was a lot of communist / socialist governments kind of in power, and the United States didn't like that because, as you know, we like pretty much labeled everything we didn't like as communism and sort of attacked it. These were almost always violent military interventions, either in sending actual forces or sponsoring violent forces. It often involved the CIA. It still often involves the CIA, although there are cases of actual US military forces physically being present in those countries. But more commonly, I would say, it's intelligence agents. A big method is the weaponizing of guerrillas and other paramilitary groups, particularly in the Northern Triangle and Argentina, and Cuba, of course. These coups and civil wars that we are essentially directly responsible for cause mass amounts of civilian death, particularly in poor and indigenous communities. And that's really important because those communities which are hardest hit by these coups and civil wars are largely the communities coming to the United States, right? A lot of rhetoric says, oh, you know, the gang members are coming. They're already here, right? And we're going to talk about this. MS-13 is a US gang. But largely the victims of this violence are who are coming to the United States. And a big sort of practical program that sponsors the coups is the School of the Americas, still in existence. Like right now, August 29th, 2020, you could go to Fort Benning and find this. It is a school specifically for the purpose of training soldiers for the destabilization of Latin America. It is almost entirely Spanish-speaking soldiers, often Latino, who are trained in, you know, the politics, etc., of Latin countries and are sent there in order to destabilize the region. This has been going on for decades. It is still happening right now. These are the countries in which we have done things. You'll notice there are 20 of them. I'll give you a wild guess as to how many countries are typically associated with Latin America. It's 21. So virtually every country in Latin America, the United States has had some form of military intervention, either through sponsorship financially or practically. A really good example of this is Venezuela. So Venezuela last year, 2019, was experiencing huge political upheaval, hugely involved by the US. And in 2019 alone, guys, this is 1 year, 3.7 million Venezuelans were forced to flee their country. This is 1 year, one country, one campaign, to give you an idea of the scope of what 20 countries means. Another way that we do this is through economic oppression, right? There's a lot of ways in which we do this, right? Trade agreements, even individuals. But what I really want to focus on, because it's really the historical sort of destabilization tactic, is what's kind of commonly referred to as banana republics. And it's not the clothing store. This is a political term. So banana republics was coined by a writer, and it refers to a nation that has a very weak economy directly due to dependence upon a single or very few natural resources. So this term was originally coined for Honduras and bananas. This was like a huge thing throughout the 1900s. Different corporations came into Honduras and then in the Northern Triangle and essentially made the economies reliant upon bananas for like decades. And it was like a huge destabilization factor. The way in which these corporations operate is unjust wages, and by that I mean starvation wages, sweatshops, and financially supporting political upheaval, right? The sweatshops thing is actually huge. When we think of sweatshops, we often think of, countries in Asia, which is totally true. But honestly, a lot of them operate out of the Northern Triangle as well. If you look at your clothes, right? I can guarantee you, you have at least 1 or 2 articles of clothing that say made in Guatemala or made in Honduras. I have some. I found some. So this sort of banana republic, which happens when these corporations come in, almost always with the purpose of avoiding some sort of regulation, whether that be trade regulations, land regulations, tax regulations. It's almost always because they don't like American law. It's not as advantageous, and so they'll go to other countries. It causes insane, and when I say insane, like, I cannot stress to you enough the amount of social and economic and class stratification. So in a lot of these countries, especially ones who are really destabilized economically by US corporations, you will have people who are very, very wealthy and very, very poor, right? The middle class, it's not a huge population, and it's slowly disappearing over time. So that's a huge factor in these like so-called banana republics. This company right here, the United Fruit Company, is essentially the company which caused these, first sort of started these banana republics. As you can see, it's a banana company. It was in Honduras, right? They essentially went to Honduras because it was, I don't remember exactly what regulations they were escaping, but I'm pretty sure it was some sort of land regulation. And they completely seized the economy. They made the country entirely reliant on one agricultural product. And they also conspired with political members of the government and paid them off in order to get them better regulations. They are one of the US forces who would finance coups, fun fact. And so you won't find a company by the name of United Fruit Company anymore, right? They changed their name, but you still know them. Their name is Chiquita Brands International. If you go to literally any grocery store in the United States, you will see bananas with that little blue sticker. That is the United Fruit Company. They changed their name. Like, I think in I don't remember, the 80s or something, but they still exist, and they operate same way. They're still running sweatshops. They're still doing unfair labor practices. They still pay off politicians, completely exist. So when you go to the grocery store, if you can, right, try to avoid buying Chiquita. And then the third way that I want to talk about how we've destabilized the US is Las Maras, or the gangs. And it means the gangs, but it refers to a particular form of gang. And Las Maras are one of, if not the driving force for why the Northern Triangle is considered by some political scientists to be the most dangerous region in the world. The reason that countries in the Northern Triangle at one point attained the highest rate of homicide in the world is because of MS-13 and MS-18. And, this is where a lot of the flashy rhetoric that anti-immigrant groups use comes from, right? It's all scare tactics and, MS-13, they're animals, and, we have to prevent every single immigrant because we never know who's working for MS-13, which is really ironic because, as you can see in the slide, MS-13 and MS-18 are both United States gangs. They started in Los Angeles, California in the late 80s, early 90s, right? And they even started because of the US. The US at the time was putting forth a bunch of racial hatred tactics, not uncommon to what we're seeing today. And there was a huge racial targeting in Los Angeles of Latino communities, but particularly El Salvadorians. That's what MS-13 mostly is now, is El Salvadorian members. So it started off, ironically enough, I think as a group of metalheads. It was really just a bunch of metalheads who their neighborhood was in danger, and they kind of fought fire with fire. And what changed was this man, Ernesto, comes in and says, I will show you how to get what you want, which was power and all of these things. Ernesto was trained by the US Green Berets in El Salvador. Remember those programs I talked about where you'd go to the School of Americas and you'd be trained and then you'd be sent to the country? That Ernesto was the direct product of these sorts of programs, right? So he used tactics that he was taught by the US military in El Salvador, which they taught him during a campaign to control the region. and he brought it to MS-13. And that's largely actually the reason why, even though MS-13 and MS-18, even though they're gangs, if you look at how they operate in communities, they operate a lot like a paramilitary force. That's not an accident. They were trained to be kind of in practice a paramilitary force. Okay, so they're a US gang. So how did they end up in Central America? The answer is everything is our fault. 101. So in the 90s, I'm sure you've heard maybe earlier today about the whole tough on crime sort of campaign that happened in the 90s, right? The gangs are a direct kind of product of that. So in the 90s, there was a huge deportation campaign in California, and they essentially took as many members of these gangs as they could find, and they shipped them off to the Northern Triangle. And as we already talked about, right, the Northern Triangle and, you know, other countries in Latin America by that point were radically, and I mean radically, destabilized, right? Not only, especially the free country, the Northern Triangle, had been suffering from decades of, you know, military and political strife, largely sponsored by the United States, and their economy was either crashing or, you know, like everybody was just living on starvation wages. So you have what essentially is a power vacuum, right? And into this power vacuum appears MS-13 and MS-18. And what they see is that there is a lot of people who can be controlled very easily. And that's sort of how that happened. So what is the sort of result of all this destabilization? Well, obviously, people are dying by the thousands, which means people are leaving by the hundreds of thousands, right? And most of them go to the United States, which, like, understandable, right? We're literally a superpower. If I was fleeing economic uncertainty, I would go to where, you know, the economy was reasonably stable. So the United States is actually the largest recipient of asylum claims in the world. However, the chances of receiving asylum in the US are becoming more and more slim by year. This is the area where at least I have seen that the current administration is really ramping it up. This was a huge issue in the Obama years. Obama still has the highest deportations, but the method of slimming asylum, I would say, is worse right now. In 2018, only 1 in 5 claims was approved, even though in the last 5 years, claim receipts, meaning new claims, have risen by 238%. To give you an idea about how crazy my life is, in 2018, right? So you saw that, like, in 1 year, in 2019, they got 301,000 new asylum claims. In the court of El Paso, they granted 4. That's not 4%. That's 4 cases. 4 individual people were given asylum in the court of El Paso. That's a little under 2% for that court. That is 1 court in 1 state of the United States. So now apply all of that to the whole country, and you see why I get headaches. So all of that destabilization leads to deflection, and this is a shorter part because this is mostly a policy thing, but we deflect our responsibility, right? Kind of like how we're having these conversations about, like, reparations and all of these things. We also need to take responsibility for the way in which we've destabilized, you know, foreign nations. I don't have time to go over all of these actions. Just know that these are all various actions taken throughout our history against immigrants. The one that I want to sort of focus on are these 2. I won't say the name of this because it does contain a racial slur, but it was a campaign in 1954 where it deported roughly 1 million, are the highest like estimates, of legally admitted immigrants. So there was a program where Mexican immigrants could come legally to do labor because we were having a labor shortage and it was crazy. And then we decided that we didn't need them anymore, so we shipped them all out. And then in the 90s, we made the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996. This is, in my opinion, where you can pretty much trace every single thing that you're seeing on the news right now. Every single thing. It made it impossibly hard to get legal immigration claims through. It completely raised the standard of what crimes you have to commit to be put in detention, including like running stoplights and stuff. Ridiculous, right? And then this is the big one. In 2003, the Department of Homeland Security is founded. So before 2003, it was at like roughly like 22 agencies or something, including INS, which was the Immigration and Naturalization Service. And all of those were formed and congealed together under one department. So when you hear people say we can't abolish DHS because, you know, we can't do it, it's only 17 years old. So we survived about 200 years of our history without it. That's all I'm saying. But the big thing about this is once this is created in 2003, you see this huge shift from immigration as a sort of service, right? Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, under the Department of Labor into enforcement under Homeland Security. And why does this happen? This happens because of what I call the wartime mentality. DHS was created in a war. They were created with the express purpose of, you know, stopping whoever they decided was causing that war. And the issue when you develop a regime on wartime mentality, you begin to treat all of your operations as like, you know, save the world hero, you know, we have to defeat the bad guys and all of these things. And what this means practically for immigrants is that the immigrants, all of them, become the bad guy because all immigration gets put under DHS. And so suddenly, right, instead of, you know, immigration sort of being a labor thing and it was sort of like back and forth with that, all of a sudden immigration becomes us against them in a way it has never been before in history. We're going to ignore this because I don't have time to talk about it. Death by 1,000 cuts. Basically, we do a lot of bad things to a lot of people. So destabilization, we deflect our responsibility. We make it as hard as possible for them to seek, you know, immigration status here. So what do we do with them when they inevitably come? Because, you know, they're still dying. We detain them, right? The third wing, detention. I call this the hidden evil because most of you don't understand how close you live to a detention center. Over 200 immigration detention centers or like camps exist across the country, but that's actually an underestimation of facilities because, fun fact, a lot of states and virtually all red states currently have agreements with ICE saying that if an immigrant who is here without papers is put in jail, the jail will just hold them for immigration. Even though, you know, they might have come in for, you know, public intoxication, you know, and they run, you know, whatever they run, fingerprints or something, and they get a little, you know, beep bop, oh, this person doesn't have any papers, and they directly tell ICE, and ICE says, hey, can you just like hold them in county jail, even though they really, there's no charge really against them for the reason that you could hold them in county jail. We just hold them for us. And states do this all the time. I can guarantee you, if you live within 20 miles of a county jail, there's probably an immigrant being held there for ICE. But fun fact, both legally present, I should say, and undocumented immigrants may be held, like to be deported. And it is an insanely expensive system. It costs about $134 per day per person for just like adult detention, and $319 per person per day for family detention. So it's just like crazy expensive. And that's also why the myth of not enough money, like they're creating their own problem. And I won't get into conditions because that we don't have a lot of time, and that is kind of a policy thing. Talk to me about it later. We're gonna skip that. Okay, we're gonna come to this. This is actually hugely important. So these two companies, you all need to memorize the names of these two companies. And I can guarantee you, every prison that you know, every immigration detention center in your area, with like maybe a few exceptions, are run by one of these two companies, CoreCivic and GEO. These are the original private prison corporations. CoreCivic was founded in Nashville, Tennessee, my hometown, really fun for me, It was founded in 1983 and was immediately rewarded its first federal contract, right? It was essentially created in order to do immigration detention. And fun fact, the idea of private prisons, this was a brand new thing. CoreCivic is essentially, the first massive private prison group. The reason that now, a lot of other countries have private prisons is because CoreCivic and GEO Group went international. And you see that they started in Australia in 1990. IRIRA was largely because their revenue was lagging, and so they lobbied and got a bunch of restrictions passed so that they could have more people in detention. And so you see an explosion of revenue after that, and after the war, 51% of their current revenue, right? And they are a billion-dollar corporation. 51% of their revenue comes singularly from federal contracts, mostly with DHS, some with the Department of Justice, right? They have received $1 billion every single year. 1 year, $1 billion, at least from 2001 to 2011. I can guarantee you those contracts are still happening in some way. And then there's GEO Group. You don't kind of see them as much, but they're more funded. They have a lot more money. They were founded in Florida, first contract awarded in 1984. They not only do detention, they also conduct deportations. And I call them the Lords of Lobbying. These guys are insanely good at what they do. So this is like a little post-conference exercise if you guys want to do this. So go to opensecrets.org, search for their profiles, and go and see if any of your representatives are on that list. I can guarantee you, if you are in a red state, and maybe 1 or 2 blue ones, not so much recently, they used to fund more Democrats. I can guarantee you they're receiving funds. And so this is one campaign cycle. In the 2018 campaign cycle, CoreCivic donated $254,000. Their biggest contribution or receiver was Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee, who got $20,000 in 2018 and almost $100,000 over the whole of her career. GEO Group spent almost $1 million in 2018 alone. And that year it was like some guy from Georgia. That was like their first time contributing. And so you see like this vicious cycle. We say, oh, they are coming and they need to improve, et cetera, et cetera. We're responsible for all of this. And I think what's craziest, and I'll talk about this and how do we proceed, is people act like immigration reform is super complicated. And in a way, the sort of finer legal aspects, sure. As far as detention, actually, we could do it tomorrow. And it actually wouldn't really even be hard. We already have programs in place that we could use. But the 4 main ways that I think that we can proceed, right? Because it's not enough to just like name problems. You also have to promote solutions. Is end our sponsorship of brutality and corruption. We need to end the School of the Americas and shut it down for good. We need to pull out of literally every Latin American country there is. We need to take responsibility for our actions, and maybe that involves reparations, maybe it doesn't, I don't know, that's kind of outside of my area, but in some way we need to acknowledge that we're the ones who have hurt these people. We need to separate the immigration court system from the executive branch. A lot of people don't know this. The court you go to for like traffic claims is not that's not the same type of court. The president runs every immigration court in this country. And I think you guys can immediately see why that's terrifying, right? And this is largely why the courts are so hard to deal with. It's because every different administration, you're having all of these things thrown at you. And even like, appeals, the Attorney General can overturn any appeal he wants. And then finally, end the practice of immigration detention and move to a system of total humanitarian parole into the United States. Again, we have these programs already. For more information, here's some books. Here's my email. Yeah. So that's it.